The Irish question dominated British party politics for over 3 decades, the moment William Gladstone converted to the cause of Home Rule for Ireland in the 1880s. The Irish question did not become the Ulster question during the Home Rule Bills of 1886 and 1893, as both bills were defeated by normal parliamentary procedures. With most Unionists based in Ulster, the Ulsterization of Irish Unionism came to the forefront with the formation of the Ulster Unionist Council in 1905. The real prospect of Home Rule in 1912 saw a violent reaction from Unionists, most vociferously so in Ulster. Edward Carson, the leader of the Irish Unionists MPs since 1910, hoped to use Ulster Unionist resistance to prevent Home Rule coming into effect in any part of Ireland. The most symbolic gesture of opposition to Home Rule was the signing of the Solomon League and Covenant on Ulster Day, 28th of September 1912, when just under 500,000 men and women signed the Covenant. Ulster Unionists also armed themselves and threatened to establish a provisional government in Ulster if Home Rule was brought into Ireland. And here is Carson inspecting a Colt Browning machine gun at an Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF, rally. Their open flouting of the law was supported by the British Conservative Party, now renamed the Unionist Party, and led from 1912 to 1923 by Andrew Bonar Law. The British Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, introduced the Third Home Rule Bill to the House of Commons on 11th of April 1912. No special provision was made for Ulster. Although it looked like Home Rule for the whole island was close at hand, the House of Lords still had a veto for 2 years, meaning Home Rule could not be enacted until 1914 at the earliest. It soon became apparent that special treatment was needed for Ulster. By late 1913, a civil war in Ireland was threatened, with Unionists and Nationalists forming military groups. Great pressure was put on John Redmond, the Irish Parliamentary Party leader, to compromise on Ulster. The Irish Parliamentary Party declared itself open to the concept of the Home Rule of Ulster within the Home Rule of Ireland. This was considered totally unacceptable by Carson. Asquith then pressured Redmond to agree to a temporary exclusion for a period of 3 years for Ulster counties, after which they would automatically come under the jurisdiction of the Irish Parliament. Within days, Redmond was informed by Augustine Birrell, the Chief Secretary of Ireland, that the exclusion period needed to be doubled from 3 to 6 years. Redmond was adamant exclusion would be temporary. Carson threatened forceful resistance unless exclusion was permanent. He insisted Unionists did not want a stay of execution for 6 years. As the country spiralled towards civil war, King George V, a keen supporter of Ulster's exclusion from Home Rule, intervened and called a conference of the main parties in Buckingham Palace in July. The conference saw no solution. Civil war in Ireland was averted by another war, the start of the First World War. According to Asquith, a case of cutting off one's head to get rid of a headache. Home Rule was put on the statute book with 2 important provisos. A suspensory bill stipulated that the Home Rule Act would not come into operation until the end of the war, and Parliament had the Prime Minister's assurance that special provision must be made for Protestant Ulster. The crisis caused by the Easter Rising in 1916 saw Irish Home Rule become an issue again during the war. Just months after the Rising was quashed, Asquith tasked David Lloyd George with initiating negotiations to implement the Home Rule Act at the earliest practicable moment. Lloyd George negotiated separately with Redmond and Carson, telling the former the exclusion of 6 counties of Ulster would be temporary, to the latter their exclusion would be permanent. Once Lloyd George's duplicity was revealed, Redmond, outmanoeuvred again, rejected the proposals. The 1916 attempts were yet another blow for Redmond and the Irish Party, whose popularity was in terminal decline, for its continued support of the war and for its perceived humiliating concession after concession in accepting some form of partition. The next time an attempt was made to solve the Irish question was in 1917, with the formation of the Irish Convention in July of that year, a failed effort by Lloyd George, now Prime Minister, to allow Irishmen to work out their own salvation. At the December 1918 general election, Sinn Féin obliterated the Irish Party by winning 73 of the 105 seats available in Ireland. The Irish Party won just 6 seats. Sinn Féin decided to abstain from taking its seats in Westminster, meaning there will be just a handful of Irish nationalist voices heard in the House of Commons as the future of Ireland was decided. The election was also a spectacular success for Ulster Unionists. In the 6 counties that would form Northern Ireland, the Unionists won 22 of the 29 seats available, with Sinn Féin winning just 3 seats. The genesis of the Government of Ireland Act 1920 came in the latter half of 1919, when Lloyd George established a committee chaired by Walter Long to draft a new Home Rule Bill. Long was a staunch unionist and rabidly anti-Sinn Féin. Unsurprisingly, the make-up of Long's committee was unionist in outlook. There was no nationalist representation whatsoever, nor were nationalists even consulted. James Craig and his associates were the only Irishmen consulted during the drafting of the bill. At the first meeting of Long's committee, a decision was made to create distinct legislatures for Ulster and the southern provinces, linked by a common council comprising representatives from both. This was the first time a British government proposed a separate parliament for Ulster. The leading nationalist MP left in Westminster, Joseph Devlin, believed the creation of a parliament for Ulster would result in the worst form of partition, and of course permanent partition. The Common Council proposed in the Government of Ireland Bill was a Council of Ireland, which would be composed of 20 members from each parliament. It was envisaged that the Council would lead to the peaceful evolution of a single parliament for all Ireland. Long's committee also advocated that all of the 9 counties of Ulster should be included in the Northern Parliament. Ulster Unionists were unhappy with this, seeking and being granted the 6 counties of Antrim, Armagh, Derry, Down, Fermanagh and Tyrone instead, and not the 9 counties of Ulster. As this was the maximum area they felt they could dominate without being outbred by Catholics. This stance was deeply unpopular amongst the 70,000 Protestants of counties Donegal, Cavan and Monaghan, who were sacrificed to the Southern administration. Thomas Moles, Westminster MP, explained that the 3 counties had to be abandoned in order to save the 6 counties, saying, "In a sinking ship with lifeboats sufficient for only 2/3 of the ship's company, were all to condemn themselves to death because all could not be saved." Even though the Ulster Unionist Council endorsed the Government of Ireland Bill reluctantly, many Ulster Unionists eventually concluded that the scheme proposed in the Government of Ireland Act would cause the least diminution of their Britishness. Sinn Féin, of course, was not in the House of Commons to debate the Government of Ireland Bill, having set up its own Parliament, Dáil Éireann. As the bill was making its way through Parliament, the British government was waging a war with Sinn Féin and its military wing, the Irish Volunteers, renamed the IRA. Sinn Féin leaders stuck steadfastly and naively to the view that Ulster would readily come into an All-Ireland Parliament once Britain was removed from the island. As the Government of Ireland Bill was making its way through Parliament for much of 1920, tensions in Ulster started to soon boil over. Violence that started in Derry City soon moved further east. And here are some images of the disturbances in Derry. Returning from the 12th of July holiday, on the 21st of July, calls were made for the expulsion of all non-loyal workers from the shipyards. Straight afterwards, a mob went on a rampage looking for potential victims. Some were stripped to their undergarments in a search for Catholic emblems such as rosary beads. Many were severely beaten. Catholics were soon expelled from many other companies in Belfast. It is estimated that a total of 10,000 men and 1,000 women workers were expelled, about 10% of the nationalist population of Belfast. Protestant socialists, known as rotten prods, were also expelled from their jobs. The unrest travelled from the workplace to the streets of Belfast, resulting in 19 dead and many more wounded or homeless within 5 days. And here are some images from the violence in Belfast. Even though most of the violence was perpetrated against Catholics, Craig demanded that an Ulster Special Constabulary be established to just serve for the area that would become Northern Ireland. And even though the British government recognised that they could be accused of taking sides and ceasing to govern impartially, they granted Craig his Special Constabulary. The Ulster Special Constabulary came into existence on 1st November 1920 with an initial strength of 3,000 planned. Craig also won the support of the British government in securing the appointment of an Assistant Under-Secretary, Ernest Clark, with responsibility just for the area that would make up Northern Ireland, and again before the Government of Ireland Bill was enacted in December 1920. His work as Assistant Under-Secretary was crucial in creating the structures of a functioning government for Northern Ireland when it came into being in the summer of 1921. Basil Brooke described him as the midwife to the new province of Ulster. Clark, supported by a small team of no more than 20, worked tirelessly from his appointment in September 1920 to set up the machinery of a new jurisdiction with very little to work with, as he testified. I found myself setting out to form a new administration armed only with a table, a chair and an Act of Parliament. The expulsions of workers and the sectarian violence in the north saw Sinn Féin make one of its first decisions directly relating to the north. It started a boycott. Its response to initiate a boycott in many ways increased the likelihood of partition. Dáil Éireann imposed a boycott of goods from Belfast and a withdrawal of funds from Belfast-based banks. In reality, the boycott soon extended to other businesses and farming and beyond Belfast too. Many saw it as an anti-partitionist move, a way to show that Northern Ireland could not survive without the rest of Ireland. Nationalist firms in Belfast were affected by the boycott too. Ironically, Dennis McCullough, one of the organisers of the IRB in Belfast and originally a supporter of the boycott, was forced to close his bagpipe factory. As he said, the Irish public buy British-made pipes rather than support this purely Republican firm. It was in an atmosphere of war, sectarian hatreds and boycotts that Bill became an Act on 23rd of December 1920, and elections to the new Parliament were set for the following May. Many in the civil service, which was administered in Dublin, were reluctant to move to Belfast to uproot their families and homes, even in cases where their work solely related to the area that would become Northern Ireland. The breaking up of the Department of Agriculture was particularly bemoaned, as it was seen as a great success since its formation 21 years earlier. Although nationalists vehemently opposed the Government of Ireland Act, the nationalist parties still contested the election for the Northern Ireland Parliament in May 1921. All nationalists fought the election from an anti-partitionist stance, claiming partition would mean national suicide. The general election resulted in an astounding victory for Ulster Unionists, winning all but 12 of the 52 seats. In fact, all of the 40 Unionist candidates were elected, including two women, Dara Chichester and Julia McMordy. Sinn Féin won just 6 seats, with the United Irish League winning the other 6. All nationalists decided to abstain from taking their seats in the new Northern Ireland Parliament, granting Unionists a monopoly on proceedings. James Craig, the Prime Minister, and his cabinet took up office in early June. The state opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament took place on the 22nd of June 1921. It was a day of pomp and ceremony, ushering in a new era in Ireland's history. Despite dire warnings, the King and Queen Mary came to Belfast to officially open the new Parliament. Belfast was draped with flags and bunting. Pavements and lampposts were painted red, white and blue. The King's pacifying speech helped pave the way for the truce between Sinn Féin and British forces weeks later. Whilst hostilities ceased in the south on the 11th of July, the birth of Northern Ireland in the summer of 1921 witnessed another wave of intense sectarian violence engulfing Belfast, resulting in the highest number of casualties since the shipyard expulsions of the previous summer. When Northern Ireland came into being in the summer of 1921, the jurisdiction had very limited powers. The Northern Domain had come into existence, but it needed to be equipped with government services. Despite the victories achieved by Unionists, the future of Northern Ireland as an entity in its original form was still not certain. This became clear once the British government began its negotiations with Sinn Féin following the truce in July. In preceding years, Sinn Féin leaders tended to overemphasise the blame attributed to Britain for causing partition and downplay the real hostility of Ulster Unionists to being governed by a Dublin Parliament. Sinn Féin President Eamon de Valera felt that the troubles in Ulster were due to British guile and nothing else. He modified his views, becoming open to accommodating Unionists in a federal Ireland externally associated within the British Commonwealth. This more conciliatory approach was evident with his willingness to meet with Craig in May 1921. Alfred Cope from Dublin Castle arranged a meeting on 5th of May between De Valera and James Craig. Craig wanted an agreement on the border, De Valera an agreement on Irish unity, both as unrealistic as the other. Craig claimed De Valera spent the time harping on the grievances of the last 700 years. After half an hour, he had reached the era of Brian Boru. After another half hour, he had advanced to a period of some king a century or two later. By this time, I was getting tired. Although no agreement was reached, they both expressed an openness to meet again, but this never happened. Much has been written about the Anglo-Irish negotiations from October to December 1921. That the Sinn Féin plenipotentiaries had a number of disadvantages over the British delegation was clear. Chief amongst them was the vast experience of the British parliamentarians over the Sinn Féin negotiators. People like Lloyd George, Winston Churchill and Lord Birkenhead were accustomed to stringent debate and opposition in Westminster, unlike the Irish delegates who were part of what was essentially a talking shop, the Dáil. Most of the British parliamentarians had no respect for the Irish, with Bonar Law declaring the Irish were an inferior race. During the negotiations, the two primary issues discussed were Ulster and the Crown. The Irish were successful in reopening the Ulster question, rekindling matters that the Unionists thought were settled. Lloyd George admitted they had a weaker case on Ulster, stating, "While British soldiers might die for the throne and empire, I do not know who will die for Tyrone and Fermanagh." Once the Irish delegation stated that their allegiance to Crown and Empire was contingent on Ireland's essential unity, Lloyd George and others within the British government appeared open to changing Northern Ireland's status if Sinn Féin would accept allegiance to the Crown. In November, Lloyd George unsuccessfully tried to squeeze Craig into accepting an All-Ireland Parliament. Craig refused to concede any ground to Lloyd George and instead won a major victory from the British Prime Minister. Lloyd George agreed to transfer services to Northern Ireland, to be transferred from 22nd of November to 1st of February 1922. That Lloyd George, the wily negotiator, would grant rather than receive concessions from Craig suggests his commitment to an All-Ireland solution was not wholly sincere. With the avenue of reaching a settlement by pressurising Craig now closed, Lloyd George looked to squeeze the Sinn Féin delegation instead. His secretary Tom Jones dangled the idea of a boundary commission to Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins. Collins was against the proposal as it sacrificed unity entirely. Griffith, however, was not alarmed. He believed there would be benefits to it, writing to De Valera that the boundary commission would give us most of Tyrone, Fermanagh and parts of Armagh and Down. The Anglo-Irish Treaty's main provision relating to Ulster was Article 12. It stipulated that if Northern Ireland opted not to join the Irish Free State, a boundary commission would determine the border in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants, so far as may be compatible with economic and geographic conditions. Central to the problem with the boundary commission was its ambiguity. No timetable was mentioned or method outlined to ascertain these wishes. How exactly economic and geographic conditions would relate to popular opinion and which would prove most important. No plebiscite was asked for. The clause was open to a number of different interpretations and no time was specified for the convening of the commission. The Sinn Féin delegation clearly blundered greatly in acceding to such a vague and indefinable clause. Nationalist leaders in the 6 and 26 counties were overly optimistic, as it would transpire, on the outcomes that would be achieved from this boundary commission, believing many areas of Northern Ireland would be transferred to the Irish Free State. The optimism over the boundary commission in many ways explains the fraction of time devoted to partition during the acrimonious Dáil debates over the treaty. Both the pro- and anti-treaty sides supported the boundary commission as a means to end, or at least limit, partition. Sovereignty was the primary cause of the split. Up until 1922, partition bore little impact on the lives of people. From 1922 to with a new government established in the south, the effects of partition became more apparent. Both Irish governments were forced to devote much attention to relations with each other and to the question of the boundary between their two jurisdictions. Northern Ireland faced significant political challenges from its birth. In the eyes of many on the island, including 1/3 of the population within its territory, it lacked legitimacy. Most nationalist-controlled local authorities within Northern Ireland chose a policy of non-recognition of the new jurisdiction. Both Tyrone and Fermanagh County Councils declared allegiance to the Dáil on the 28th of November 1921. The Northern Government suspended both councils as a result. In total, 21 nationalist-controlled authorities were suspended by April 1922. Unionists west of the Bann River demanded further punishment. On top of suspending councils, it looked to take back control of them. It did this by abolishing proportional representation, PR, compelling councillors to pledge an oath of allegiance to the Crown, and gerrymandering regions to reduce radically the number of local councils held by nationalists. The provisional government, the transitional government for the 26 counties until the Irish Free State officially came into being on 6th of December 1922, led by Michael Collins, had the difficult task of trying to prevent a civil war within its own jurisdiction and react to conflict in the northern jurisdiction almost from the very moment of its inception. Collins, almost alone amongst the leadership of Sinn Féin, had come to accept the reality of partition and strove to do something to undermine it. Lloyd George complained to Churchill, "We could get Mr. Collins to talk about nothing else." He pursued a dangerous path of pursuing peace through pacts with James Craig in January and March of 1922 on the one hand, and sanctioning a policy of military activity along and across the border on the other. The pacts with Craig were in many ways a public front for Collins, who by his other actions sought to destabilise the northern jurisdiction. On top of arming the IRA for engagements in the north, Collins led a policy of non-recognition of the 6 counties, which caused deep frustration for the British and Northern Irish governments. One of the primary policies of non-recognition involved the payment of salaries of teachers based in Northern Ireland who refused to recognise the 6 counties' Ministry of Education. The provisional government was also extremely tardy in transferring civil service personnel and files to Belfast. Collins met with opposition from within the provisional government for his policy on the north, and once he was killed in August 1922, a new policy prevailed to recognise the northern government and to discontinue the obstructionist policies. Leading the new initiative was Ernest Blythe, Minister for Local Government and an Ulster-born Protestant. Another step by the Free State government in March 1923 had arguably the biggest impact in cementing partition, the imposition of customs duties on imported goods. The creation of a customs barrier was key in translating partition into a reality. The Free State government did so in a bid to achieve fiscal independence from Britain and to generate revenue for the Exchequer. It was also an attempt to apply economic pressure on the nascent Northern Ireland jurisdiction. In announcing the imposition, the government stated that pending a decision as to the future boundary line, a temporary frontier will be placed along the boundary line between the 6 northern and 26 southern counties. The temporary frontier on imported goods lasted for over 70 years, only rescinded due to the introduction of the single market throughout the European Union in 1993. The decision to erect customs barriers before the Boundary Commission had convened showed perhaps a lack of faith in the Commission and made it more difficult to make changes to the border subsequently. The Free State government was the first to appoint its Commissioner to the Boundary Commission, Eoin MacNeill, the Minister of Education, in July 1923. Almost a year later, in June 1924, the British government appointed the chairperson, Richard Feetham, a British-born judge based in South Africa. With the Northern government refusing to appoint its commissioner, the British intervened by selecting Joseph R. Fisher. The Commission met for the first time in November 1924. From December 1924 to July 1925, the 3 commissioners conducted informal and formal hearings, interviewing more than 500 witnesses based on written statements submitted in advance. The work completed by the Commission would not be revealed for decades due to a leaking of the recommendations by the pro-unionist newspaper, The Morning Post, in November 1925. Much to the surprise of many nationalists, no large-scale transfers were on offer. In fact, a rich portion of East Donegal was to be transferred to the north. The leaked report recommended the shortening of the border by 50 miles, transferring 286 square miles to the south and 77 square miles to the north. The leak caused outrage in Dublin. With the furore caused by the leaking, MacNeill resigned from the Commission, the Free State Government and even the Dáil, claiming as he departed that he wasn't the most suitable person to be a commissioner. Pleading ignorance of the Commission's findings, the President of the Free State Executive Council, W.T. Cosgrave, claimed it would be a farce and travesty if the forecasts which had been published were correct. Realising the danger the crisis posed to the government, he dashed over to London to have the report shelved. James Craig suggested for the Free State to be relieved of part of the British national debt. The Free State government accepted Craig's suggestion, showing the extent to which the Free State government was prepared to purchase its own independence at the expense of Irish unity. The border remained as it is to the present day. Cosgrave was fooling few people by calling the agreement a damn good bargain. The Free State government and its Sinn Féin predecessor had failed politically just as it had militarily in preventing partition and unifying the island. Northern Ireland experienced very violent beginnings. Between 1920 and 1922, waves of violence encompassing many sectarian deaths engulfed the 6 counties. It is estimated that over 550 people were killed violently in the 6 counties in this period. Approximately 300 of the dead were Catholics, over 170 were Protestants, and over 80 were members of the security forces. Belfast accounted for the vast bulk of the deaths, with just under 460. Catholics, with 1/4 of the population of Belfast, suffered over 70% of the deaths in the city. Catholic relief organisations estimated that 23,000 Catholics had been forced out of their homes and that about 500 Catholic-owned businesses had been destroyed. Those forced from their homes had to seek refuge elsewhere in places such as Dundalk, in Dublin and in Glasgow. On 14th of January 1922, Dan Hogan was one of several Gaelic footballers from Monaghan arrested by the specials in Dromore in County Tyrone. They were on their way to the GAA's Ulster Senior Football Final in Derry City, where they intended to rescue 3 men on their death sentence in Derry Jail. The arrests prompted Collins to order a major IRA incursion across the border into the counties of Tyrone and Fermanagh on the night of 7-8 February. Some 40 prominent loyalists were seized and taken south. The kidnapped loyalists were to be held as hostages for the Derry jail and football prisoners. The kidnappings caused an outrage in the Unionist community. The Northern government subsequently bolstered the border areas with many more specials. The roads crossing into the Free State were then made impassable by blowing up bridges or digging trenches and were covered by constabulary posts. Only the main roads were left open, and on these there were permanent roadblocks. After a skirmish at Clones railway station in County Monaghan, which led to the deaths of 4 specials and many more wounded and captured, violence erupted in Belfast, resulting in 34 people being killed between 13th and 15th of February. One of the incidents was one of the most horrific of all that occurred during those 2 years of violence in Belfast, where in Weaver Street off York Road in North Belfast, a grenade was thrown at a group of Catholic children playing. 2 died instantly and 4 more subsequently died from their wounds. The months of February and March 1922 witnessed levels of violence in the north it had not experienced before. Between February 11th and the end of March, 51 Catholics were killed, with 115 wounded, and 32 Protestants were killed, with 86 wounded. The most notorious incident in March was the Mcmahon murders of 24th of March. After the IRA killed 2 specials on the 23rd of March, the home of Owen Mcmahon, a Catholic publican, was attacked early the next morning, where all the male members in the house were shot, resulting in 6 deaths. And here are some images relating to their deaths and funerals. The IRA sought revenge. On 31st of March, a bomb was thrown into the home of Francis Donnelly, a Protestant, on Brown Street, severely wounding him and his 2 daughters. His 2 boys, aged 12 and 2, died from their injuries. It would be an exaggeration to suggest that Northern Ireland was in peril of going out of existence during the height of the IRA attacks on its territory. It was beleaguered though, and the British government was tired of the crippling costs of maintaining such a large and one-sided security apparatus. Even though the Northern government controlled the Special Constabulary, the British government financed it with vast sums of money. The RIC was formally disbanded in May 1922 and replaced by the RUC in the beginning of June as the North's new regular police force. Whilst the Specials remained exclusively Protestant in composition, in the end Catholics comprised 1/6 of the numbers of the RUC, not 1/3 as allocated. No attempt was made to increase this proportion, and by the late 1960s, Catholics only made up 10% of the RUC. One of the most identifiable consequences of partition was the forced displacement of people, those on the wrong side of the border. Many moved to Scotland and England. Others relocated to towns along the border, such as Dundalk. Dublin saw large numbers of refugees arriving throughout the first half of 1922. And here is a young Belfast refugee outside Marlborough Hall in Glasnevin in Dublin. The Northern Offensive of May 1922 transpired to be the last military attempt by the Free State to destabilise the North. It involved pro- and anti-treaty troops from all over Ireland. Belfast was engulfed in dozens of serious fires. Railway stations and mills were destroyed. By the end of June, support from the South had ceased though, and the supply of men and arms had dried up. The civil war there had begun. The northern divisions of the IRA were disbanded, many moving south to join the Free State Army. One of the primary reasons for the moving south was the large-scale enforcement of the Special Powers Act after the assassination of an MP, W.J. Twaddle, on 22nd of May. Twaddle was shot dead on the way to his outfitter's shop. The Northern government then ordered the roundup of some 500 Sinn Féin sympathisers. 300 of them were interned on board the Argenta, a converted cargo vessel transformed to a prison ship, moored firstly in Belfast Lough, then later in Larne Bay. The response from the authorities was ferocious. Leading IRA member in Belfast, Seamus Woods, reported, "The enemy are continually raiding and arresting. The heavy sentences, and particularly the flogging, making the civilians very loath to keep wanted men or arms." The IRA in the north retreated. Nothing demonstrated the complexity of creating a jurisdiction from scratch, arguably more so than the law. Under the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, the judiciary of Ireland was divided into two judiciaries, north and south. There was also a counter system of justice in place, the Republican or Dáil courts, when Ireland was partitioned. Whilst the Free State was presented with most aspects of a functioning legal system, Northern Ireland was faced with the gargantuan task of creating a whole new justice system for a new entity. The person chosen to be the first Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland was a Catholic, Sir Denis Henry. Whilst Henry was a Catholic, he was not a nationalist, holding a truly unique position by being a Catholic Ulster Unionist MP before he was appointed as Lord Chief Justice. He was faced with the unenviable task of ensuring the judiciary and official appointments, as well as a functioning justice system, were in place by 1st of October 1921. He also had to secure a building as a courthouse. The government purchased the site of the old potato market, and was here that the new law courts opened in 1933. For the 12 years before the permanent courthouse was built, it was necessary to use temporary accommodation. The Antrim County Courthouse on the Crumlin Road in Belfast was chosen as the best option available at the time. The Government of Ireland Act had practically severed the Bar of Ireland into two bodies, but all the then existing members of the Bar had the right of audience in both areas of Ireland reserved to them. One of these was Frances Coyle, the first woman to be called to the Irish Bar in November 1921. Coyle was immediately followed by Avril Deverell on the same day. Both women made headlines around the world for being the first women to be called to the bar in Britain or Ireland. That day was also the first call of a divided Irish bar. Coyle, originally from Belfast, pursued her professional career in Northern Ireland, whilst Deverell from Greystones in County Wicklow pursued her career in the south. Coyle, like all other students from Northern Ireland at the time, still had to study at King's Inns in Dublin to qualify as a barrister. This arrangement continued until 1925. Reconciling two distinct political and judicial entities under the King's Inns umbrella proved difficult, and strains started to show. The Northern Committee of King's Inns was irked that some in the south were exempt from taking examinations for war service, as the war service in question was in some instances in the forces opposed to the Crown. Those exempted included Kevin O'Higgins, Minister for Justice in the Free State. King's Inns ignored the Northern Committee's threats to leave and even inflamed the situation by proposing that Irish should be a compulsory language for a call to the Irish Bar. The Northern Bar decided to sever connections and subsequently established an Inns of Court of Northern Ireland, which was inaugurated at the Belfast Law Courts on the 11th of January 1926. The main common link between both Irish justice systems was now broken. The spectre of partition posed vast problems and some opportunities for the Catholic churches and the main Protestant denominations. With the partition of Ireland, the Catholic Church saw itself receiving the best and worst of outcomes with the creation of both political entities. It went on to exert huge control over the Irish Free State on the one hand and became the main voice for the significant but powerless minority in Northern Ireland on the other. There was never a question of the Catholic Church dividing itself along partitionist lines. It remained an all-Ireland body. The primate of all Ireland was the Archbishop of Armagh, and as a body, the whole hierarchy in Ireland met regularly. In fact, of all organisations that were all-Ireland bodies before partition, religious ones had the highest number that remained so after the founding of the two jurisdictions. With the partitioning of Ireland, the three main Protestant religions retained their all-Ireland structures. Even though the majority of Church of Ireland members resided in Northern Ireland, the machinery of the Church remained largely based in the South. The one religion in Ireland that saw the greatest institutional changes due to partition was Judaism. It was no longer organised on an all-Ireland basis. Both Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State were able to show greater scope for separate expressions of how education was to be run in a divided rather than a united country. Such separate expressions were clearly demonstrated in the very different approaches taken on education within both jurisdictions. Whereas Northern Ireland, with Lord Londonderry as Minister of Education, introduced wide-ranging changes that essentially sought to democratise education, the South imposed minimal structural reforms but fundamentally changed the education system in its attempt to Gaelicise Ireland. The divergence in paths was also clearly illustrated by the obstructionist tactics of the South, who refused to recognise the Northern jurisdiction, and the failure of both entities to cooperate on areas of common interest, such as teacher training and examinations. The Labour movement was also faced with many challenges when the country was partitioned. The movement included a divergent group of people who had to operate under enormous sectarian and political pressures. Partial union was achieved, particularly within trade unionism, by clinging to core interests within the movement and by offering a large degree of autonomy to Northern Labour activists. The complexity of the railway infrastructure and ownership within Ireland was compounded dramatically by the creation of a border. 5 railway companies were directly affected by the new border by serving both sides of it. This was further exacerbated by the Free State's decision to impose a customs barrier in 1923. Both Irish governments agreed that the Free State would legislate for railway companies based solely in the Free State territory, and the Northern Government would not look to amalgamate railway companies in Northern Ireland with British ones. Cross-border cooperation was harder won on the issue of fishing rights on Lough and River Foyle. Despite disputes over fishing on the Foyle spanned for 3 decades after partition. The disputes showed the haphazard way in which the border was drawn up. No boundary was delimited at any point for either Lough Foyle or Lough Carlingford. Nobody knew where the borderline was on various waterways straddling the border as a result. The political partition of the island of Ireland posed problems for all sporting bodies too. The border forced all sports to look at their internal governance structures. Unlike in soccer and athletics and cycling, most Irish governing bodies managed to maintain unity by considerable compromise, as issues of political symbolism were tailored to accommodate diverse political and cultural interests. There was a readiness from many sporting bodies to incorporate inoffensive and neutral flags, such as the 4 Provinces flag, and anthems and emblems to maintain unity. Great efforts were also made to democratise the internal governance structures of those sports. Most sports that remained united also did not have the identity issues faced by sports like soccer. Sports such as rugby, hockey, cricket, tennis and bowls were primarily the preserve of Protestants from the upper classes of society. The GAA, as a pan-nationalist association dominated by Catholics, did little to encourage Protestant and Unionist membership. Soccer, like athletics and cycling, had to cater for different religions and classes, making it more difficult to maintain unity. The partition of Ireland was the most significant event of modern Irish history. The political ramifications of partition still exist within and beyond the island. At its worst, it was directly responsible for hundreds of deaths and injuries, most of them of civilians, at the time of Northern Ireland's birth. Thousands were displaced from their homes. Many were forced from their jobs. There were many day-to-day effects of partition, particularly after the imposition of customs barriers in 1923. Major disruptions were caused in crossing the border. Checks and stops became the norm, whether by car or by train. Many organisations and societies were divided along partitionist lines, reflecting the new political realities. And yet, many organisations and groups continued on as before. Most religions remained All-Ireland bodies. Trade unions maintained a 32-county presence, as did most sports. They remained united for a variety of reasons, such as historical inertia, financial reasons, self-interest and pragmatism. Politically, the new jurisdictions moved further and further apart. The political and legal partition was not matched by a social and cultural partition. No organisation or group was beholden to national political decisions. They were free to make their own decisions for their members, without interference in almost all cases. Socially and culturally, there were many differences, but also many links between North and South, links that remain to this date. And if you want to find out more about my talk, which was essentially a summary of my book, Birth of the Border, which you can, of course, pick up at most bookshops or online. Thank you.